Great. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the AI Ethics Global Perspectives panel. My name is Stefan Verhulst, and I'm the co-founder of the GovLab based here in New York. And I'm delighted to be here with Julia Stojanovic, who is a professor at New York University and also the lead of the Responsible AI Center at NYU, and is a course leader together with myself of the AI Ethics Global Perspectives course, and who will be my co-moderator for today's session as well. This is the 9th panel of the AI Ethics Global Perspectives course. And for those who don't know the AI Ethics Global Perspectives course, what we try to do with the course is to bring in different perspectives from around the world and from around different sectors on what does it mean to be ethical within the context of artificial intelligence. And till date, we have more than 30 modules up on our course, and the modules are being delivered by world-renowned and also global diverse faculty. And each time when we add a new set of modules, we also hope to establish a panel so that we not only can watch the video, but also have more of a discussion with the faculty that have contributed to the course as well. And that's the purpose of today, and the purpose of all those panels is to actually have a broader conversation with the guest faculty of the AI ethics course around their topics that they have submitted, but also around other topics that are coming up during those panels. And I'm delighted that today we have yet again a really wonderful panel that will focus on AI ethics from a variety of perspectives. And I give the floor to Julia to introduce the different panelists that we have today.
Thank you, Stefan, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's my pleasure to introduce three wonderful panelists for our conversation today. The first is Favour Borokini. She is a data and digital rights researcher at Pollicy, working remotely from Nigeria. Welcome, Favour. In her role at Pollicy, she arches a number of knotty topics related to technology-facilitated violence against women and the general impact of subsisting and emerging technologies on social justice and equality. Favour also works as a content writer and with Ethical Intelligence, an AI ethics consulting firm, and with various research groups on topics related to data protection regulation and healthcare delivery. She is currently an affiliate with the Future Society. Our second panelist is Jibu Elias. He is an AI ethicist, researcher, and the leading expert on India's AI ecosystem, and is the research and content lead at INDIAai, the national AI portal for the government of India. Jibu is also a member of the OECD network of experts on AI and one of the founding editorial board members of Springer's AI and Ethics Journal, the first multidisciplinary academic journal on AI ethics. With years of experience covering emerging technologies with PCMag and the Times of India group, Jibu's work currently focuses on building a unified AI ecosystem in India. Welcome, Jibu. Looking forward to hearing from you. Our final speaker will be Tannya Jajal. She's a keynote speaker, futurist, and author of the upcoming book, Thinking Machines, AI and the Intelligence Explosion. Tannya encourages current and future leaders to explore the ethical and practical implications of exponential technologies on business, life, and society at large. She is an advocate of radical innovation, the rise of meaningful work and skills in a post-automation world, and a proponent of educational reform. Tannya is a regional resource manager at VMware, a market leader in hybrid cloud solutions, leading the way forward for digital transformation. Welcome, Tannya. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts today. And over to you, Stefan.
Thanks so much, Julia, for the introduction. And it just remains for me to introduce a few logistical issues. First of all, today's session will be recorded. And so those that want to watch it again or share with those that couldn't be today, we will share the recording after today's session as well. Secondly, if you have any questions for any of the panelists or for all of the panelists, feel free to use the Q&A function and also indicate to whom the question is being addressed. And lastly, we will have a Q&A at the end as well. So we will have first Favour and then Jibu and then Tannya reflect on some of the elements that were mentioned in their module, but then we will make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end as well. With that, over to you, Julia, to get us started with the conversations as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stefan. And the first panelist is going to be Favour Borokini, who contributed a very interesting module called AI and Nigeria, Exploring Threats to Human Rights. I have a couple of questions for you, Favour. Let's start with the following. One major concern that you point out in your module is the issue of accountability. How are systems of accountability evolving to address human rights issues in the AI ecosystem?
Okay, thank you so much, Julia. And I'd like to confirm if you can hear me before I proceed. All right, great. Well, I'd like to begin by briefly talking about what I understand accountability to mean. I think when we're talking about accountability, we are referring to expectations that have been placed on organizations or government, members of the government, policymakers, people that are in charge of doing a particular thing. So there is an expectation that they will conduct themselves in a particular way, that they will bear responsibility for certain things. And as it comes to AI and technology generally, there is definitely, well, there's been an evolution in terms of how people view AI itself, and how that view is affecting regulation. So we've seen a shift from emphasis on killer bots, killer robot, the type you see in iRobot. I've seen iRobot and some pieces of Terminator and other sci-fi movies, to more present harms. And we're talking about worsening inequality, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, gender-based violence, although probably less so in when it comes to gender-based violence, although it's just as important. And with this shift has come a realization that there's a need for regulation. And so a lot of principles, guidelines, and frameworks have sprung up. At the end of 2020, I remember reading that over 100 ethical guidelines and frameworks have sprung up already. So stakeholders and the government, tech firms are coming alive to the fact that there's a need for regulation, that this is not, that a Wild West scenario is not the best for any. And of course, there's also some tension between ethical frameworks and legislation. So of course, ethical frameworks are desirable because they are flexible and they can easily be amended to deal with present day realities. But because they are flexible, any number of organizations can sign any number of frameworks and just choose to not comply. But laws are more binding, but they take way more time to pass, and they are rigid and undesirable for the reasons ethical frameworks are desirable. And as it relates to Africa, it's pretty much the same. A number of African countries are developing national AI frameworks. The AU as well has passed a has indicated its interest in the development of ethical AI in Africa, noting its impact on gender equality and social justice on the continent. And there is increased discussion related to how African frameworks like Ubuntu, Ujamaa, and others are applicable, can be applied to the governance of AI. So that's just a brief overview of how that framework is evolving.
Thank you very much for this, Favour. My next question is, you spoke about human rights and other and specific categories of individuals, right, who may be particularly threatened by the irresponsible and unaccountable use of AI technology. What is the role of intersectionality, in your opinion, in AI ethics, especially as it pertains to threats to human rights?
Well, I think intersectionality is a framework that helps everybody understand how various aspects of a person's identity could impact them and impact the way they are viewed and therefore affected by laws, legislations, and definitely technologies like AI. So in a report I recently contributed to at my organization, we explored how, for instance, Somali women who live in Kenya and who are Muslim are affected, are surveilled, are under constant surveillance on various axes of oppression. So due to their ethnicity, because they are a minority group in another country, because of their gender, because they are female, because of their religion, because they are Muslim, and also because they are immigrants generally. So what this means is that there are certain forms of oppression that then cannot be analyzed or cannot be alleviated only by creating policies and frameworks that alleviate gender-based bias, for instance. We also have to create all-encompassing policies that address not just gender bias, but also ethnic discriminations. And it's the same in many parts of Africa. In Nigeria, for instance, we have 3 major ethnic groups, but there are over 100 smaller ethnic groups. And so there are all sorts of historical violence, injustices. We've had a civil war between 2 of the major ethnic groups, and all this contributes to the way Nigeria is currently constituted. So apart from the fact that your personality as an African, for instance, dictates how you would be viewed by people from outside your continent, if you're applying for a visa, for instance, or if you are traveling internationally, within the continent as well, dominant groups also hold power. And these groups who hold power are the ones that are responsible for policy making and for the deployment or setting up of what technologies will be used. So these are some of the ways that the intersecting identities of people place them, at an axis, at unique axis of oppression that need heterogeneous solutions to address.
Thank you very much for this perspective. It's fascinating indeed, right? I mean, we try to be international in this effort and in this course, and then I think that we can all see how valuable it is to bring in voices other than those from the global north, right? I wanted to ask a follow-up question, actually, Favour. You mentioned some of the African frameworks and their potential applicability to the AI ethics debate, such as Ubuntu. Would you elaborate on this a little bit?
Okay, this is a very interesting topic for me because so Ubuntu is an African philosophy that is communally based, that tries to, it's sort of in contrast to cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. It's more, I am because we are. So an individual is a person because of the community that they were born into. But the interesting thing about Ubuntu is that it's primarily a Southern African and Eastern African philosophy. And as a Nigerian who is from West Africa, there have, sometimes when I think about the way it is discussed, I feel that there isn't enough critique or analysis as to how Africa has changed as a continent. I think that there are important lessons that these African philosophies can teach us about how we need to think about our identity and how we need to change some of our individualistic, capitalist interactions with people and with technology. But it is also, in my opinion, extremely reductionist to approach regulation on the adoption that everybody has a communal values communality in Africa. We've all been affected by colonialism, and to an extent, many young people in Africa today value, they are rather individualistic. They value their own space, and everybody. There's just such a shift that while it's important to note that there are important values that can be gleaned from our traditional philosophies, that it is not enough to merely identify these philosophies and then apply them blindly if we are developing AI governance and policy frameworks. But we also need to reflect on how Africa and Africans have changed and how they have continued to evolve, and how, and I think that understanding this will definitely throw a lot more light as to how to dynamically apply these frameworks in Africa today.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Favour. I'm sure that there will be many follow-up questions for you when we do our Q&A. So I'll hand over to Stefan now for the next panelist.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks, Favour and Julia, for that as well. And I think Favour has set us up already very well to the conversation I wanted to have with Jibu, because Jibu's module focused exactly on the concept of applying and considering different models of thought and philosophy to AI ethics. And the module that you, Jibu, brought to the AI ethics course was, of course, focused on the role of culture in ethics, an Eastern perspective, where you actually make the case that indeed there are different philosophical approaches that can inform the AI ethics debate in a more sophisticated, but also more diverse kind of way. And I think what Favour was referring to with regard to Ubuntu is another kind of contribution to that line of thought, that actually there are different ways of looking at AI ethics that are based upon different cultures that we need to take into account. And so eager to hear from you, Jibu, on how do we broaden the current discourse as it relates to AI ethics and bring in those kinds of different philosophical traditions, such as Ubuntu, but you have focused on the Eastern, of course, philosophical tradition as well. And so eager to hear from you on, first of all, what do we mean by Eastern philosophy, but also how does it apply to AI ethics?
Yes, first of all, let me thank Stefan and Julia for this opportunity. It was a great honor to do this particular module, and it was a great experience personally for me as well. Now, when we speak about AI ethics, I often feel that the cultural element is missing, and then culture is what enables how we see the world, right? It depends on how we see a particular scenario. The culture plays a key role. There is this small passage I read during my school days, which looked into something very simple. For example, let's assume you are a guest in an Indian household, right? There are a few protocols you have to follow, right? You have to take your shoes off, and when they offer you something to eat, and they will definitely offer you, right? They will offer you some tea and some snacks. You should decline, even though how much ever you want. You should decline once or twice. It's this how do I say, sort of a act that play that going on there. So you decline, then they will give you, and then if you eat the full snack also, it's a sign of disrespect, right? You have to leave a little bit, say, in a way showing that, oh, I'm full, thank you. But this changes in some other cultures where it's disrespectful to leave food behind. You have to eat the whole food. So it's something very simple as being a guest at a house is affected so differently by the culture. And so that's why culture plays a critical role in how we perceive the world around us. And definitely, when it comes to AI and its and our ethical thoughts are built on top of culture as well. Now, speaking from an Eastern perspective, it's quite interesting how diverse the Eastern approach to AI is. Now, there is this general tendency, when we look into East, we tend to put together everything together. You have the Chinese, the Koreans, the Japanese together as one group. You call them Asians, and you call the Indians, the Bangladeshis, so the Bengalis, the Pakistanis, Sri Lankans, and you call them South Asians, right? You put them in these buckets. But it's very interesting that how different a culture like Korean culture and Japanese culture, which are pretty much have influenced each other for centuries, and who are neighboring countries, is different when it comes to AI. For example, there is this study that pointed out on how you approach AI from a tool point of view to a partner point of view. Now, tool is like, okay, this is my phone, this is my tool. I use it for XYZ purpose, and I see it like that. A partner point of view is a little bit more, right? It's not just a tool, it's more than that. And interestingly, while Korea sits on the extreme left of the spectrum, let's say left to right, the partner to the tool to partner, Japan sits on the other extreme end. And this is reflected not just in the culture, it is reflected even in the policy space, even in the regulations, even in the frameworks they are doing. Now, that's a very simple example on why we need a cultural approach. Now, how can we broaden the current discourse? But I think the first step towards it is to accept that there are other ideas, like what Favour just mentioned, the Ubuntu philosophy, and there are many ideas out there. But what's happening right now is, let's say the global AI ethics discourse is dominated by, let's say, certain few elements, right? For example, there was a study done by Anna Jobin and her team, of INDIAai Zurich, and they found out that around 63 to 68% of the work or the framework that's being done in AI ethics is predominantly Western ideals based, right? I'm not denying the quality of Western philosophical thought or ethical perceptions, but let's say, the idea of one size fits all is not the right approach here, especially when you consider that a technology like AI will have different social impacts, different depending on the cultural settings, right? So that's one thing. Now, secondly, we need to we need to ensure that the discourse isn't focused on, let's say, one or two topics. I mean, racial bias is a very serious issue, but at the same time, it's not the only issues that's happening because of, let's say, bad AI practices, right? So I think the first step towards, and importantly, we have to understand that AI is more of a social science problem rather than a technological problem, right? There is this tendency to fix any problem that's created by technology with more technology, right? If it's a tech problem, you'll add more tech. If there's an AI problem, you said there's an explainable AI. You have that tendency, and you'll say, it's incorporated into the algorithm or the system or something like that. So first of all, we need to accept the fact that other ideas can add value. Secondly, we need to ensure that the people who will end up using these tools or being affected by these tools are diverse, while the people who are creating these tools are a small group of people. Let's say sitting in Silicon Valley with a more generic how do I say profiles. So for example, there is this representation of women from global south. It's very minuscule when it comes to creating AI tools. And also there is this tendency to be the discourse to be dominated by, let's say, countries like US, of course, where these tools are mostly created, but at the same time, there are countries like Mozambique where you don't have enough data generation. I mean, when the country doesn't have like 4 or 5% internet connectivity, 4 or 5% of the people are connected to the internet. So that's the first challenges, to accept that we need different ideas, we need different perspectives, right? So I think that's they say, you need to accept it. If you have to fix something, you have to accept there is a problem with it, right? So I think that's the first step towards it. Secondly, yes, having people like Favour here or Tannya here, different ideas should come in, and nobody is arguing that we should take an idea from this particular culture or that particular culture, right? We should have a discourse, see what benefits people, and maybe also, it could be interesting to see regional variations of certain, let's say frameworks, approaches, right? So if certain culture doesn't fit across the world, for example, how how Japan look at AI, it won't be applicable to other countries, but then we can have a regional, how do we say, a tweaking for the framework or approach there. So I think that's one way to get started on this whole thing.
Great, thanks so much, Jibu. And there is also a question already for, I think, both Favour and for everyone here related to what you both already discussed as well, which refers to clearly, I think, and by the way, the whole idea behind the AI ethics global perspectives course is exactly that we need to have that kind of global conversation, but it turns out to be still kind of exceptional to have that, right? And so what stands in the way for actually having more of that kind of global diverse conversation where we bring in different perspectives and different cultures to the concept of AI? Is it, anyway, there was already a discussion, of course, a result of some of the colonization practices that have had an impact on it. But is it also, for instance, a result of the fact that a lot of the AI tools or the AI methods are actually, the values are embedded where the tools are developed as well, right? And so that's one of the questions I have. Are there other kind of reasons why it is so hard for actually having that kind of diverse and more, anyway, unique perspective coming from a cultural and philosophical angle?
I think you're correct, Stefan. A lot of that depends on where these tools are created, right? The people who create these tools, of course, their ideas will be incorporated. But now then you look at, I mean, it's an interesting topic to look altogether, right? So far we had this, let's say, US or a few other Western dominance in generating these tools. Now we are seeing a shift towards China, right? Now, what will be the idea of an AI tool developed by the Chinese researcher? For example, the idea of something as simple as privacy is totally different from a Western standpoint of view and from a Chinese standpoint of view. For a Western standpoint of view, the idea of privacy is paramount. And if you go to any of these Eastern cultures, especially East Asian Chinese culture, and you are saying, I want privacy, it is often seen as a sign of selfishness rather than a basic right. So, and we have seen from time on, how China has their surveillance system, how they have their social credit system, and the facial recognition system they are using, and what they are capable of pulling with this AI. And yes, there are a large plan to use AI as a, how do you say, for the asymmetric warfare strategy as well, right? So then there's a question, right? If we are saying the creators approach to AI can be allowed to reflect on the tools they are creating, then this will be another whole question. We are opening a whole Pandora's box altogether, and especially Now we are living in an age where a lot of Chinese tools are being used. For example, TikTok is a very good example, right? Created in China, it has been quite popular across the globe. So that's where, I mean, yeah, like you pointed out, the first challenge is, yes, the reason why we haven't had this Eastern ideas being not necessarily incorporated is because the tools are mostly created by the let's say people in the West. At the same time, we are seeing a lot of work happening in India, a lot of work happening in China. But then can we say that, okay, since these tools are being created in China, can we incorporate their ideas, or can we incorporate Indian ideas? So that's why I think we need to come together and have a global consensus. What is okay, what is not okay.
Great, thanks so much, Jibu. And there are some other questions as well, but I will give the floor to Julia for having Tanya's perspective on all of this as well, and then we can have a broader conversation, perhaps amongst all of us as well, on those issues. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Stefan. So Tannya, you contributed a module on the ethical implications of technology on humanity, in which you give your perspective as a futurist, right? On what does a future with AI and post AI look like? So let me ask you, first, in your work promoting future fluencies or competencies, how do concepts like diversity and inclusivity factor into the conversation? Can these concepts mitigate some of the ethical implications and perhaps dangers of technology?
Right, yeah, so let's start. I'd like to circle, I really like where this conversation is heading with Eastern philosophy, and I'd like to circle back what future fluencies really is to that and why I'm motivated by it, right? So when we're talking about future fluencies, what we refer to in the education space, at least, is those competencies, the skills, the values, and the mindsets that we will need in order to thrive in the future, both because of technological automation, meaning when you coexist with intelligent machines, but also with the rise of technology, right? Because of technological displacement or job displacement due to technological automation. So future fluencies specifically are very different from the traditional way in which we have learned, in which we have modeled the educational model for high school students, primary school students, and beyond, in the sense that future fluencies are not siloed. So the whole idea and concept behind enabling somebody to thrive in this VUCA world, right, which is a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, is that you should be able to think in a multidisciplinary way. So a lot of this is rooted in what I have been introduced to as the systems theory of life, right, which essentially I was introduced to it by Fritjof Capra, who's a physicist and Eastern academic. And he brings together a lot of Eastern philosophies with traditional scientific thought and rationality, and makes the argument for why we need to start thinking about solving problems in the future with this combined perspective, right? For most of human history, we have focused on the Newtonian Cartesian way of life, mind-body dualism. We've been largely materialistic, largely focused on what are typically masculine traits, right, which are very important and have a huge role to play in society and in technological innovation. But now we need to kind of bring back we need to balance the weighing scales, so to say, which means that we need to bring in some concepts around Eastern philosophy, specifically around the holistic aspect of Eastern philosophy when it comes to solving global grand challenges. So if we bring that at a very ground level, right? Today, if you want to be a virtual reality architect, it's no longer enough to be an engineer. You also need to be a creator and an artist, and you also need to have those skill sets, right? Similarly, you can see organizations like Google, IBM, etc., which is promising coming from those organizations, investing, not enough, but they're still investing in what's known as accessibility tech, where you have engineers who are building technological tools that can be utilized by all members of society. Essentially, diversity and inclusivity are at the absolute baseline of building those technologies in the first place. Now, generally, there's not enough investment from the world into that direction, but of course, platforms like this and education, educating future thinkers to think holistically, to think in a systems way, will encourage that our future innovators bring that to the forefront, where diversity and inclusivity are, it's a non-question, right? It has to be there. It's an absolute given. So I don't think we're there yet, but of course the hope is to be able to get there. And by developing the right competencies and revamping really our education system in some ways, we might be able to get there. Maybe not now, maybe 20, 30, 50 years from now.
Yeah, great. Thank you. This is a great perspective. And also, as we know, things accelerate, right? I mean, things that we expect to happen within 30 years are going to be here tomorrow, essentially.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, my next question is about the role of ethics in a post-AI, post-automation world. So what is that world? What is a post-AI world? And what role does ethics have to play in this transition?
Right. So my perspective is I see a post-AI, post-automation world as a world in which we have, we're on that exponential trend. We're currently surrounded by what are known as narrow AI systems. This is mostly AI that's able to automate single range tasks, right? Like checking the weather or playing a game of chess. But if we ever make that jump, that leap into having artificial general intelligence, where we start to outsource more and more parts of our cognition to intelligence systems in the way that we create algorithms, if we ever reach that point, I see that point as a post-AI world, right? Where most, if not all, of menial tasks and cognitive tasks that human beings once did can now be completed, can now be done, algorithmically, can be fed into a system and can have a defined outcome. So in that world, ethics has an absolutely important role to play, right? Now, realistically, when you're on the ground and you're especially in emerging economies. I'm based in the UAE and we work closely with the governments here. We work with a lot of entities to drive digital transformation. Realistically, when you're on that ground and you're implementing technology at that level, most people are thinking business, money, CapEx, OpEx, right? All those things. But we're seeing a slow trend where organizations, like I mentioned, like the IBMs and the Googles of the world are investing, not enough, but they're still investing a little bit into building ethical bodies around AI, where they're trying to enable some element of transparency around the technology that's created, and they're employing individuals who care about this, who are actually doing something about it. So the role of ethics has to be a part of the AI landscape one way or the other. There's no question about it, because if not, it's our very existence that's on the line, right? So it's so important that we don't have a choice but to involve it as part of the conversation. Where are we on that curve? I think we have certain more enlightened parts of the world, more enlightened individuals within different societies who are doing something about it. But we still kind of need to level the playing field so that all economies don't have to worry about basic things like, where will we get our food? Where will we get our basic necessities from, so that we can focus on these also equally important conversations. But unfortunately, on that, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they come on the second tier of the conversation, right? First, we need to solve those basic issues. Now, that's not to say that they should be mutually exclusive issues. We can absolutely tackle both hand in hand. But that realistically, we do need to be aware of where we are on the global playing field, which is it's not fully leveled.
Thank you very much for this, Tannya.
Yeah, and Julia, if I would, if I may, connect with some of the questions, and one of the first questions here in the Q&A goes to, in part, to what Tannya was referring to, also with regard to corporations stepping up with regard to AI, right, and AI ethics. And so one of the questions here was, how can, from Uthman Ali, how can corporations be culturally sensitive with the use of AI without sliding into moral relativism? And so it goes back to some of the discussions that we've had with Favour and Jibu on the importance of cultural, but also how do corporations be cultural sensitive? And a question, perhaps you can get started, and then Jibu and Favour can, and Julia can also engage on that question. And then there are a range of questions that perhaps Julia can moderate as well for Favour and Jibu as well. Over to you, Tannya.
Right.
Do you want to get going?
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't sure who you were talking to. Yes. So when it comes to corporations and holding them accountable, right? I mean, we live in a day and age where we're increasingly seeing private organizations being held accountable for their actions, right? This is a fundamentally different time than at any other time in human history in that particular sense. mostly because all these organizations have a direct say into our personal lives, right? It's no longer just a corporate problem, it's a personal problem, specifically with the rise of social media platforms. You would know what I'm referring to. So I think when it comes to holding corporations responsible for that, we need to move away completely, ditch the narrative that organizations are individuals that should not get involved in a moral conversation. They absolutely should. We need to push that conversation forward, and we need to make sure that there are policymakers within government, within public and private sector, and at the intersection of those two, that are making sure that happens. And interestingly, within the landscape of organizations like VMware, which is where I work, they are exploring the possibility of having what's known as a new C-level role, which is the chief ethical officer within these organizations. Now, some of them are already there, some are still kind of getting there, but that push, and I think the public comment and pressure from the public to have that as these organizations increasingly become a part of our lives will become more and more prevalent. And I agree with Julia's characterization of how exponentially things are growing, right? Which is we might get there sooner than we think.
Great. Anyone else who wants to tackle that question?
Yes.
Jibu?
So I really appreciate what Tannya has mentioned, but I don't agree with all of, disagree on few of the points. So if you are looking from a ethical standpoint of corporations, right? Throughout the history, if you look, whether it's the oil industry or the tobacco industry, or now we are seeing with the big tech, ultimately, if the shareholders and the stakeholders drive something, then the corporates will be open to ethics. And yes, we are there is accountability these days, but what has resulted, where is it going, right? Like we have seen the role of Facebook in so many issues, right? Whether it's in the communal violence in Sri Lanka, communal violence in India, in Myanmar and all, but still they are still strong. There is nothing happened, right? No Facebook employee has gone to jail, as I know, imprisoned as far as I am aware. So the whole idea, and we have seen with what Google did with Timnit and her colleague, right? The AI ethicist. So it's the idea of making profit, which is the primary motive behind corporates, and the idea of being ethical and being morally correct doesn't always go hand in hand. So that's one thing I want to mention. So that it will be interesting to see, yes. So right now what we are saying is there is this whole commoditization or a commercialization of responsible AI. Every company is coming and saying, oh, we are responsible. We have this 10 pillars, we have this 5 pillars. But the question is, there is this thought experiment I read a few months ago, which says that, let's say there is an AI model that will kill senior citizens. I know it's not a good scenario, but murder senior citizens and convert them into soil, desk. Now, imagine if somebody's coming and saying this AI model, yeah, it's accountable. How he chooses its next senior citizen to be murdered is very fair. Its data is secure, and yeah, it's explainable. Can you call it a responsible AI model? That's what right now happening. But then you have to look into what is it doing, right? It's the same thing, right? That's what worries me. It's not the explainability part, the accountability part, that yeah, those things are there. But in the end, what are the things these AI systems are capable of doing, as we have seen. For example, a few years back only, I think in 2013 or 14 only, Facebook ran an experiment on people's news feed. It chose 2 groups of people and they ran an experiment, try to impact their mood. It keeps showing a negative content to the first group and positive content to the second group. Then they realize whatever the content they are showing in the newsfeed is affecting their mood. Is it ethical? No, but of course, so these are the questions. What these tools are being used for should be also contested and should also comes under the accountability part. That's my point.
Great. Favour, Julia, want to react to that question, or do you want to touch on another question as well? Julia.
Yeah, I'd love for Favour to comment, and also maybe to fold in a question that's addressed to you, Favour, in Q&A, that says, if alternative principles philosophies such as Ubuntu are still not as holistic as hoped, which principles would you like to see more discussed? And maybe we can kind of respond to this question together with the whole moral relativism story.
Okay, thank you again. So, well, I think moral relativism and moral, being objective about morality is a question that I don't think anybody can answer. Like nobody can say that this or that is the best approach. I think to answer to answer Jajal's question, I personally favor a principle developed by Bell Hooks, which talks about bringing people who are the margins into the center. I think this is a very useful framework because because it is a framework, it is kind of objective, but because who is at the center and who is at the margin in every society is different, it means that it gives some kind of flexibility in how we should be thinking about the application of certain technologies. So this past week, there has been this huge conversation on Twitter regarding Swedish hospitality, and interestingly, there are very different parallels and contrasts between the way various cultures historical perspectives related to why Swedes decide to do as the conversation says they do, related to feeding people. And then comparing it to my own experience growing up shows that some of the rationale regarding why certain cultural practices are the way, some of the rationale are actually the same, even though the actions play out differently. So one culture values individualism, and then they say that part of the dignity of being a human being is to not be beholden to another, and that it is rude or impolite to feed someone else's child without calling in to find out if they would like you to do so for their child. And then another culture says that you should give people food if they come to your house. The underlying, there is a commonality there, which is of course valuing or respecting the other person. So if a corporation, a Swedish corporation like IKEA, for instance, is deploying some kind of technology, like an AI technology, the culturally sensitive thing would be to figure out in a particular region or in a particular country where you are going to set up your office, what the common ethical or cultural practices are, how to not be disrespectful, how to be unoffensive in carrying out deploying your products and your services. So I think that if you look at the fact that a lot of people do not actually intend to do harm, but they have certain considerations which they value or which they bear in mind, then that shows that if you are deploying your services in a strange land, in a place that has a different culture from where you are, that you should try to learn about what the cultural contexts are. It is not enough to say that you have good intentions. You need to figure out what the cultural sensibilities are and what have shaped those. And I remember reading, there's a popular gaming company, a Japanese one. They have this, I was reading their AI ethics and values page, and they said something regarding candle, and it relates to a sense of wonder and a sense of excitement and And basically, I understood that to mean in innovation. So this might not be a concept that has been conceptualized in the sense that it might not have a particular name in my culture. I'm Yoruba, for instance, but it is still something that I have observed to be of value to many Yoruba people, many Nigerians today, in the way technology is often deployed for fun. A lot of research, of course, shows that a lot of the ways that we use the internet today has to do with watching movies, playing games. In many corporations, a lot of admins usually come out to restrict the internet use of young people in Nigeria. And they say young people in Nigeria are always using the internet to watch movies and to chat on social media. But I understand that to mean that these are the primary ways through which we can exert some kind of influence, some kind of interaction, our interaction with the internet in a way that makes sense to us. So I think many ways that there are a lot of commonalities, and that those commonalities need to be discovered and built on in order for, and I think that this would be a very useful way of bridging the gap between different ethical, cultural perspectives and frameworks. It is, you cannot say that you are not going to develop an ethical framework for a particular culture that is different from yours, or that you are going to do something that is abhorrent because it is the culture, abhorrent to natural justice and equity, just because it's the culture of a place where you are going to operate. That is, in my opinion, extremely ridiculous. And I've seen a lot of people seeming to think that. So there are a lot of commonalities that are respectful to human rights. And if you carefully consider these commonalities and you think about people who exist on the margins and how your technology can bring them into the center and be beneficial to them, I think that we'll be on our way to resolving some of these issues.
Thank you very much, Favour. Let me go to Jibu next to ask for any reactions, reflections to Favour's statement, and also perhaps to fold in answers to a couple of the questions that came in for you over Q&A. Specifically, I think that questions from Elizabeth and from Shubangi are synergistic, right? So Elizabeth asks for Jibu, great talk. Thank you. Clearly, ethical diversity is important, and these differences will always be important. But are there ethical norms that do or should transcend cultures? And then another question in a similar vein is that culture is important when designing technology and challenging the one-size-fits-all perspective. But what do we do when the culture may not be inclusive or just?
I think I will start with the second question, and I will come to Elizabeth's question. Both are very interesting questions. So, with the Shubangi's question, I want to mention another example. You know, what happens if the culture is not inclusive, and what is the role of tech? In Saudi Arabia, women cannot travel abroad without a consent, signed consent by a male guardian. You know, it can be father, a husband, or brother, or adult son. You know, if the son is a grown-up. Now, I don't know if this is still there after MBS and all, but yeah, this is the system. Now, what happened is in 2015, it's called Yellow Slip, and they tried to add tech into it, you know, as a part of the whole Saudi's e-governance strategy. So previously, it was a document, you know, paper document, right? If you want to go abroad, if you're a woman, unfortunately, I don't endorse this kind of regulation. It's very unfortunate that countries still have this kind of practices. So if you in that country, you need to get this slip signed and you submit and you travel abroad. Now, what happened when technology was brought in? They created an app, right? A mobile app, so that intended to replace this infamous yellow slip. Now, what happened is the apps now alert the male relative of woman about every movement of this woman, right? So there was a consent form, and they tried to replace that consent form with technology. Now you effectively ended up creating a surveillance system, personal surveillance system as well. So this is what happened, like Shubhangi pointed out, when the culture is not inclusive, adding tech, tech can't solve problems, tech will make the things worse. So that's why, yes, I'm not in any way suggesting that we should take every practice from every culture, but we should be also mindful about what we are taking, right? We should also have certain ideas. Now that makes me come to Elizabeth's point, there are norms and practices, that should transcend cultures. For example, we know one shall not kill another person. I'm saying very fundamental example. One shall not cheat, right? One shall not. There are these kind of very basic practices that we see, right? So that's where we feel there are elements of all the culture. Now that how does that translate into an AI ethics, right? Especially considering that even in this Ukraine-Russia war itself, so many AI tools are being used. There are drones being used. The lethal automated weapons are being used. Are we allowed to use these things, right? If we follow a particular ethical standpoint of view, right? And similarly, bringing in another Eastern perspective is Buddhist perspective, right? Buddhism is one of the most prominent religion in Asia. It originated in India, and there's a whole work done by a Thai scholar called Swaraj Hanglo. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he has done an amazing work on Buddhist perspective on AI. And if you look at these religions, like whether it's Buddhist perspective or Jainist perspective, or to an extent Hindu perspective, the fundamental, according to this philosophy, is the fundamental. The use of any technology is to try to decrease pain and suffering. That's what Buddhism says. You should try to decrease pain and suffering. And then how should we speak about using these technologies? What if, like, you have seen facial recognition technology should be used only if it can be shown that it can reduce suffering or promote well-being. So there are these kind of philosophies also that can transcend across cultures, and on which many of us can agree upon. So that's why we need to have a larger discourse. And then again, I think at the point Tannya brought it up, right? That the time of an AGI, right? So I don't know how far we are. I'm not the right person to answer it. Maybe a couple of decades, or maybe a half a century. But again, like, according to Buddhism, it has a very relaxed set of conditions when it comes to personhood. So if you look at something like Buddhism, it says an AI can be a person, as long as it can replicate some of the human functionality, some of the human cognitive behavior. So then it will open the whole question of, does an AI has rights, right? Or does it have a human rights? Now, the one advantage automation has over humans is automation can go beyond 8 hours work days. Automation doesn't need summer vacation. AI doesn't need to be have paid increments. Now, if you assume you gave a human status to this AI, then what will be these conditions will be? So it will open. There are a lot of questions, and that's why we have to have an open debate on it. We have to bring all the best minds out there, even in every corner of the world. So sometimes they have the right solutions for this question.
Thank you very much, Jibu. We're at time, so I'm just going to go to Tannya for her final reactions, and then we'll thank everybody.
Okay, I'll keep this really brief. Somebody asked in the Q&A about how we can teach values sustainably at an early age. I can only speak from personal experience in the education space. We need to move away from rote memorizations. And one of the best ways to do it, you actually see this with a lot of young minds, even at the high school level, when they're given project-based learning and experiential learning. That is when you ask them, what problem in the world do you want to solve? Okay, now create a prototype and MVP about it. You can actually guide them to think about things that extend beyond their compassion and sympathy. Similarly, if you teach them Eastern mysticism, a lot of the values deeply ingrained in that is related to relaxed sense of selfhood, which is expanding your sense of self beyond yourself to consider the environment, other people, and so on. And I think that mindset will be crucial in the post-AI world. So that's my final thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I really agree to that. That's a very good point Tannya brought up.
Great. On that note and on that mindset, unfortunately, we will have to close because I'm sensitive to everyone's time. Favour, Jibu, Tannya, and Julia, thanks so much for being part of yet another panel. Unfortunately, we only have 1 hour. It seems like we should spend, anyway, a week exploring the different angles that you all have brought to the table and more. But again, this is the whole rationale behind the course of AI Ethics Global Perspectives. And for those who have not yet visited the course, please go to aiethics.org, aiethicscourse.org, and check out the modules that Favour, Jibu, and Tannya have submitted, and many more. With that, thanks so much again, and stay in the loop, and have a wonderful weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.